everyone for being here. So we're going to talk a little bit, well, I guess, first I will introduce myself, like Carmen said. So I was actually in higher education working and as a student for almost 20 years at Portland State University. I even have my little PSU cup here to accompany me. I then did a little work with Mercy Corps. I worked at USAID working on humanitarian assistance, and now I'm with the Center for International Environmental Law. So I've had quite the career. I'm super happy to be here. I love talking about gender and doing training, so I was very happy that Carmen invited me. My background is in human resources and equity and inclusion. And then, like Carmen said, we met through the Society for Gender Professionals. It's an awesome organization that talks about gender equity worldwide. So Carmen can add a comment in the chat with the website if you're interested in learning about that. Personally, I am queer. I am a non-binary person. I'm actually a gender, and we will find out what that means in a few minutes. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns. I am white, of European descent. I'm an Oregonian. This is Oregon in my picture here, where I grew up. Very beautiful. There's a little lighthouse in the background. I'm neurodivergent and I'm a big nerd. So I'm happy to nerd out with gender about you all today. So our goals here are to just learn a little bit more about the identities under the umbrella of LGBTQIA2S+. There's a lot of them, and try to disambiguate some terms. A lot of these get really mixed up and people don't necessarily know what they mean. So I'm going to talk about those and then really reflect on how we can be more inclusive of those identities in our personal lives and of course on campus, be you faculty, staff, or student. So again, we'll have questions at the end. You can put them in the chat for now, but I won't be able to look because there's a lot happening between my two screens, but yeah, we will get to them then. So before we start, Carmen's going to launch a poll, and don't worry, your participation is anonymous. I would like to know how many of you have really sat and thought about why you identify with your gender, the gender that you do. I will move this off of my screen. So yes, you have really thought about it. No, you have not, or you're unsure if you really have spent that time more than, a few minutes. Great. Oh, we have so many, 40, there's what, 60 of us? So 50. Oh my God. I can actually just show the answers. We are split pretty much 50-50, and it looks like we have almost everyone. This is actually pretty standard. It's usually 50-50, unless I'm talking to, queer groups or something. So that's awesome. Those of you who have not really reflected on your gender, I encourage you to do so. Talk to friends and family. I've learned some fascinating things by asking people about their gender identity, people who I would normally presume are cis. So this is great. We can go to end poll. Oh, share results, but you already saw. Okay. Go away. Sorry. So the LGBTQIA2S+ acronym combines gender, which is internal identity, sex, and sexuality. And like I said, a lot of these are often conflated. So first I'm going to talk about some terminology. This acronym also changes a lot. So sometimes you'll see different configurations. You'll see gender and sexual minorities. You'll see SOGI identities. There's a lot of words to describe it. So we'll do what we can today to help out with that. So first, the difference between sex and gender, because these are often mixed up. So sex is the biological construction of our body. This includes things like sex organs and chromosomes, and it's often assigned at birth based on genitalia, and they generally only assign as male or female. We're going to talk about sex in a few minutes, so we'll get into that more. Gender, on the other hand, is somebody's internal sense of identity. So if somebody like me asks you what gender you are, many of you will just be able to immediately answer because you feel it internally, no matter what sex you were assigned at birth. However, gender is a concept that is defined by social and cultural norms. It includes things like gender roles and behaviors and gender expression. Again, we'll talk about in a minute. Some people even talk about feminine or masculine energy. So like the vibe somebody gives off, like, oh, she has such feminine energy. But of course that aligns with some social definition of what feminine even means in the first place. A part of the gender puzzle is that this definition changes across time and space. So as a basic example, nowadays in the US, we think of pink as feminine, but until about 100 years ago, blue was actually this delicate feminine color, and pink was a strong masculine color. So a young girl wearing pink would have been considered masculine or possibly gender nonconforming. Researcher, I love Meg John Barker, a researcher in the UK, talks about how gender is biopsychosocial, which means it's like our neurons and our hormones and our psychological makeup, the societal influences that we grow up with, all of this and more forms this like big messy concept that we call gender. And some of that does include attributes from the sex column as well. So also please note, this is a very Western way of looking at sex and gender. Various cultures have different ways of looking at sex and gender and sexuality. And even in the Western context, this is like a relatively new way of looking at these, because gender and sex have historically just been assumed to be the same thing. So everything's complicated is my summary there. So some gender terms, so we're all on the same page. Cisgender, or cis for shorthand, refers to people who do identify with the sex or gender that they were assigned at birth. So for example, a cis woman is somebody who was assigned a girl at birth and they internally identify as a girl or a woman. Transgender, or trans for short, people do not identify with the sex or gender they were assigned at birth. So a trans woman would be a baby assigned a boy at birth who internally identifies as a girl or a woman. In both examples, both women identify as such based on their own perception of what woman is. And a lot of women probably have very different, I know they do because I've asked them, different definitions of what woman means to them. Non-binary people do not experience their gender as strictly male or female. So their gender exists outside of those two buckets, like somewhere along the spectrum on the screen here. Oh my God, I just lost my place, I'm sorry. Some non-binary people consider themselves trans since they do not identify with the sex assigned to them at birth, myself included, and some do not. So whether or not a non-binary person identifies as transgender is completely up to them. There's not a right or wrong answer, it's about their identity. Of note, gender affirming surgery or medical intervention like hormones are never required for anyone to be legitimately trans or non-binary, and don't ask, it's invasive to ask. Again, sex and gender, these are separate things. Different people have different opinions on their bodies, just like cis people. Historically, trans people have had to like pass as the quote opposite gender, but this doesn't necessarily reflect their actual wants for their bodies. This is also a reason we use the term transgender now, because it's about gender. In many places, including the US, we no longer use the word transsexual. First off, of course, because gender identity is not about sex. But also that term has been deemed derogatory by many people within the trans community. And so we need to respect that. Please always, of course, ally tip, try to have an updated understanding of like what the acceptable terms are for any marginalized group in your community, in your work, and on campus. So the phrase non-binary is often used as like a blanket term to describe all the gender identities that fall outside of the strict binary of woman or man. And so this nice umbrella image talks about, or it shows how many genders fall under this umbrella. So we have agender, gender fluid, gender queer. This also includes gender minorities around the world, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I also want to acknowledge non-binary. It's an imperfect term. It's pretty generic. It's very US centric. Again, it's not perfect, but it's a common language that we have now. So the current Western definitions of gender and sexuality are pretty modern, and they don't actually reflect the world's diverse culture and history, as many of you may be very aware of. So many gender minorities played really central roles in their culture, but colonizers decided that diversity in gender and sexuality are considered barbaric or ungodly, and they attempted to eliminate them. This is through forced assimilation, changing laws to make certain presentations or actions illegal, or just flat out murdering them. Sometimes in the US, there's this sentiment that trans and non-binary genders are this like newfangled thing that American kids these days are doing, but it's not new, and it's definitely not Western at all. So as you can see on this map, which is really cool, it's hyperlinked in the presentation, which I will definitely make sure everybody has access to. Gender diversity has existed all over the world for thousands of years. This doesn't even cover it, but it's just a cool little snapshot. Unfortunately, some of these places have taken on the stigmas of their oppressors. So cultures that were once really open to diversity in gender and sexuality today might be more heteronormative, might be more cisnormative because of those intentional efforts of colonization to eliminate them and their diversity. But these people still exist. It's very important. They're still there. They're at the margins of society often. How sex and gender are treated also differs across cultures. So while Western societies, like I said, may assign gender and sex at birth based on genitals, this isn't always the case. So for example, the Igbo of Nigeria appear to assign gender around age 5, and the Mbuti of Central Africa do not assign a specific gender to a child until after puberty, which is awesome. So gender in its binary Western concept is represented here by boy or girl. So this also applies to sexuality. There's straight or gay, or gender expression. There's masculine or feminine. So we're slowly moving away from the binary, and these terms are now sometimes defined on spectrums. So this one represents the identities that fall between boy and girl, or again, masculine, feminine, straight and gay. Which is good, it's progress. But the Trevor Project has gone further in looking at them in more than one dimension. So I love this beautiful like amoeba model, as I call it, which represents things are more complicated than just a spectrum. And it shows that boy and girl aren't necessarily the only two opposites, which is what spectrums do. So in this model, we have like the classic boy and man here on the left, we have girl and woman on top, but there's also non-binary and agender, and a lot of places and colors in between. So I definitely encourage everyone to like think of the amoeba model when you see any sort of spectrum or binary, because it's a really interesting way to rethink things that are often shown as opposites. So the beautiful amoebas describe gender identity like we just saw, but also gender expression and sexuality, which I'm going to go over real quick. So for gender expression, we have classic binary terms like masculine and feminine, but also androgynous and genderless. And so someone can be a feminine man, or they can be a masculine non-binary person, or one of 100 other configurations. So gender identity and gender expression don't have to be correlated. On a separate amoeba on the right is sexuality. And so you could be attracted to men or women or non-binary people, which yes is a thing, or not have any sexual attraction, which is asexual. And again, lots of configurations. So this is not tied to gender identity or gender expression again, but they're often conflated. So an example, when I was growing up, boys were assumed to be masculine and attracted to women, and the quote opposite was true for girls. And so if you deviated from any of these sort of prescriptive concepts, then you were simply gay. It was the 90s. Everybody was gay as a derogatory term. And this is, while these things aren't necessarily related, but my childhood peers from small town Oregon may not agree, but actually it's possible to be a woman who is androgynous and attracted to men and non-binary people, right? They're these separate buckets. Or as another example, drag queens can enjoy performing femininity, but they can still be straight cisgender men. It doesn't mean they're trans women. This also means you can't tell someone's gender or sexuality simply by looking at them, especially because, of course, many people remain hidden for safety reasons. So gaydar is not actually a thing. It's just a bunch of stereotypes about somebody's gender expression. It doesn't tell you their gender identity. It doesn't tell you their sexuality. So next time you see somebody conflating these things, or if you start to do it yourself, we all make assumptions. I do it too still. Now you can sort of think back to these nice amoebas and hopefully, gain some clarity or have a conversation with them about that. Also, of course, as a caveat, like I will say on almost every slide, there are cultures throughout the world who do have an interdependency between gender and sexuality. So there's not a right answer. There's not one way to think about these things, and sort of separation is it's a very like Western and US centric concept. So heteronormativity is the act of just assuming people are straight by default. Cisnormativity does the same about being cisgender. And so it also assumes that if you aren't these things, hetero and cis, then there's something wrong or different about you, right? That there's this default that everybody should be a certain way. And so there's a lot of queer and trans people out there who are assumed to be straight and cis by the way they present, by the way that, people make assumptions about them. So this can be, a non-binary person gendered as a woman, as I often am. Or maybe by the gender of their partner. So, a bisexual man who's dating a cis woman, people assume he is a straight man. Heteronormativity and cisnormativity erases these people's identities so they can feel invisible, or have to come out over and over again. Like, no, I told you I'm not straight, like I'm bi, I'm just dating somebody of this particular different gender. So this can happen to individuals, like making assumptions about somebody you see, or, assumptions based on somebody's partner, but this also happens systemically. So, having binary gendered bathrooms assumes non-binary people don't exist. The medical system assumes everybody is cisgender, and so they don't have a lot of trans affirming care. So cis normativity, heteronormativity are not just annoying, but they're very harmful. And I like to call those out to get people to really think about the assumptions that they make in these normative worlds. So we talked about gender and sexuality, which are internal identities. So I'm going to take a minute to talk about sex, which again is based on biology. So intersex characteristics are those that do not fit medical or social norms for male or female bodies. There are over 40 varieties of intersex traits. This can be androgen insensitivity, micropenis, various combinations of hormones like XXY, and lots of others, again, over 40. I won't list them all. Because these bodies are different, people with intersex traits experience a lot of stigmatization, discrimination, a lot of harmful practices. One of those is non-consensual medical interventions like genital surgery to make their bodies more typically male or female. This is done to babies, and it's terrible, and it still happens all the time. So while we have socially defined norms for what genitalia constitutes male and female, sex is a lot more complicated than that. So for example, some people assigned female at birth naturally have more testosterone or more body hair than someone else assigned male at birth. There's more variation within groups than between groups. There's also not consensus around what belongs like in the box of intersex. So the Intersex Society of North America has some interesting examples. So like, how small does a penis have to be before it counts as intersex? I mean, we're talking millimeters. Do you count sex chromosome variations if there's no external sexual ambiguity? If somebody, sort of looks like a typical woman, but is XXY, what does that mean? So I really like this graph here, and it's a cool article too, if you want to read more about this, that shows that sex and gender aren't binary, they are bimodal, right? It's about distributions and statistics. It's not about, one or the other. If you're a stats nerd, you will really like this article that this image is from. So another problem with understanding intersex variations is that they're common, but they're not always known or documented, right? So don't raise your hand, but like, how many of us have had hormone or chromosome tests? I have not, right? Most of us don't really know. So this makes estimation difficult, but a common stat is that nearly 2% of people are born with intersex variations, though honestly, it's probably an understatement. So this is as common as A negative blood, red eyes, or no, red hair, green eyes, or the entire population of Russia compared to the global population. But who do we hear about more? Russians or intersex people, especially now? Are people with A negative blood, like myself, forcibly operated on to like drain us and give us a more common blood type? No, that's super messed up. But for some reason, it's okay to do for intersex babies. So the stereotypes that go along with sex binarism are very, very harmful to people who live outside of those binaries. Despite what we're taught in high school biology class, sex is not binary, right? And so since sex isn't just genitals, some people find out about being intersex at various stages in life. So this can be as babies, depending on that external genital ambiguity. It could be during puberty when lots of things are changing, or when they're trying to conceive and they go get some testing and they find out, oh, that's what's happening. Or for probably a lot of us, never, right? Sex is a spectrum and there's so many variables. It's not just like two shapes of Legos and you're just one or the other. And then also of note, intersex is not a gender. And so intersex people can identify their genders however they choose: man, woman, non-binary, transgender, etc. Some do consider themselves transgender and some may not. So again, it depends on the person, and we just need to respect that. So a bit about pronouns, which is a hot topic right now, which I love talking about. So this is how you talk about someone. So she went to the store with her friend. She, her, and he, him are the standard English pronouns. These are considered binary. Non-binary examples include they, them, which I use. So they went to the store with their friend, or there's some other ones like Z, Zir. Z went to the store with Zir friend. And then, there's some of these in the image. There's lots of these. They're called neopronouns. We don't need to get into that. The image does point out, though, that MX, pronounced mix, is a gender neutral version of Ms. or Mr. We've been seeing this on a lot of forms. They're becoming more common, and some non-binary and trans, but also cis people use them just if they don't want to be identified with their gender. Just like women use to all use Mrs. or Miss, and then we created Ms. in the 70s because, of course, women are like, don't define me based on my marriage status. So they, them is generally considered neutral if you aren't sure about somebody's pronouns or you don't know who they are. So the whistleblower submitted their report last week, comes up all the time. Someone forgot their bag, happens all the time. This has been used as gender neutral singular since the 1300s. Fascinating linguistic history there. Many people find it easy to use they when a person and their gender is unknown. This happens all the time, right? Like this, in these examples. But they find it really difficult when somebody explicitly asks for they, them pronouns to be used, which I think is kind of funny because when you're thinking about it, it's hard, but when you're doing it sort of naturally, then it's easy. So please practice. I know we all have decades of conditioning. I still mess up sometimes, but this is something we can change. Just takes a little bit of practice. So someone's pronouns also don't necessarily tell you what their gender identity is. It's not a shortcut, right? Some non-binary people use those, typically binary pronouns. Also, just like with gender identity, you can't tell someone's pronouns by looking at them. So just believe people, use whatever pronouns they ask for. Trans, binary, and non-binary people are at a much higher risk of mental health issues, suicidal ideation, and this is all related to lack of support for their gender. And so using the correct pronouns shows respect. It's a very easy way to just literally like save people's lives, especially youth who are going through a ton of trauma right now, just looking at the news. If you make a mistake, again, happens to us all, you can just correct yourself and move on. Don't make a big deal out of it. If you aren't sure what someone's pronouns are, you can introduce yours and they might do the same. So that's a way that you can maybe sneak it in there, or you can just ask respectfully. Most people, especially trans and non-binary people, would rather you ask and get it right than make an assumption. And then you can, once you hear it from them, then you can correct others if you hear that person being misgendered. So again, always just ask respectfully, and check people's email signatures or social media first. A lot of trans and non-binary people will share their pronouns there and nobody looks, so they keep getting misgendered. And it's like, hey, I've been trying to tell you every time I send you an email. And then while English is incorporating more gender neutral options, not every language has a great alternative for gender neutral pronouns, which I will briefly talk about. I love language, so it's really important. It adds a lot of complication to everything. So depending on where you were raised and what language you speak or language is, you will probably think about gender or even everyday words differently. Some languages do not have any gendered pronouns like he and she, and some have a lot more than two. And so this image on the bottom right here is an example of some neutral pronouns in various languages. I love seeing all of them. I'm sure there's lots more now because this image is actually like 10 years old. Grammatical gender. So this is a system that assigns gender to nouns and exists in a lot of languages. These genders don't always align across languages. So for example, the moon in Spanish or Italian is la luna, but in German is der Mond, which is masculine, and in Italian it's and Spanish is feminine. I like to think the moon is gender fluid. I also, when I was giving this presentation about 2 years ago, an Italian told me that the noun for table in Italian is tavola. It's feminine, and Italians describe tables as being communal spaces that are sort of centered around family, right? These like traditionally sort of feminine ways of describing things. But in German, table is a masculine word, and Germans describe tables with masculine terms like strength. So I didn't verify this, she just told me, but I thought it was really interesting. And of course I trust her experiences. So in a lot of languages, the default person or default animal is a binary male, such as mankind. And as feminists will tell you, when a person is defined as a man, it doesn't turn out so great for people who are not men. Unfortunately, this is hard coded into a lot of language and a lot of laws, just like a lot of binary things are. In some languages, you can have a group of 99 women or non-binary people and one man, and then the gender of the group will be binary male. Then when it comes to addressing people politely, this one's super hard. The way to address people like ladies and gentlemen is binary. Some people will say guys, gals, and non-binary pals, which I like, but you can also use friends or colleagues or everyone. There's a lot of ways to do this. To say excuse me to a person on the street, you might say excuse me ma'am, or a senora or mademoiselle, which puts you, the speaker, in charge of assuming someone's gender, which of course we can't know by looking at them. So this leads to misgendering, especially for non-binary people. I'm called ma'am or ladies or whatever all the time. So I advocate for just like leaving those words out and saying, excuse me, and not putting the gendered honorific there. But it's really hard because that's polite for a lot of people. And so this is a sticky point right now. There's not really an answer. So yeah, language, all of its rules, all of its variations is super complicated. But the progress that we've seen and will continue to see comes from pushing tradition. And so I'm definitely a tradition pusher, and I encourage you all to be too. And then having the words available to describe or even recognize ourselves is essential. And so one of the reasons that we have an increase of out, trans, and especially non-binary people in the US in the past few years is simply the fact that people, including myself, are like, oh, that's an option. There's like a word for how I feel. And of course, seeing people be able to live their lives and not basically be miserable, which is how it has been in the past. Language is also really important for how marginalized groups are spoken about and treated socially by others. So for example, the word queer was derogatory for a long time. Now it's been reclaimed by a lot of people in that community. And so yeah, language is just, it's very important. It's very sticky, and it impacts how we think about people so much. So I could talk about language for 1,000 years. Great, it's 11:40, we have 20 minutes. So I'm just gonna talk a bit about some inclusivity and allyship on campus, and then a little bit in our personal lives. So these are some tips Carmen and I have gone over together and thinking about how to create more inclusivity on campus. So when you see a lack of inclusivity, so somebody's using, uninclusive language, or data collection is really binary and non-inclusive, policies, research you conduct, et cetera, just say, if you see something, say something. Speak up, especially if you were cis and straight. That's a really great way you could be an ally for us. We can learn from other schools, other people who have done this before. Oh, and again, I will be sharing these slides, so don't feel like you have to write all this down unless you want to, of course. Yeah, a lot of people, I worked at Portland State, we had like a big queer resource center, right? There's a lot of examples in the communities. Collaborate with others, so you can join an employee resource group, join a student group, just like work with other people to do research on how we can make like projects or lessons a little more inclusive. For faculty and staff, like actively create classrooms, actively create spaces that are explicitly inclusive, tell people like it's okay to be you, it's okay to be trans, like I will respect whatever pronouns you want, etc. If you're in a position of power, this is very, very important, and it becomes much more rare the like farther up you go on hierarchies in general, not specifically at Montgomery or anything, but it's very important. Creating inclusive policies and lessons. This takes some work, right? It takes some research, but for example, in lessons, if you're teaching about Western Asian history, like find some books or literature or something written by queer or trans authors. If you're teaching science, and be sure to incorporate these like concepts of intersex. And so there's ways to inclusivize. There's lots of information about there. There's like specific like biology groups who talk about this, right? So when possible, incorporate those to show examples, to show normalization, because we haven't heard, none of us mostly heard this growing up, which has impacted us today. So like, let's, do better for future. Share and centralize resources. This can be, digital places to find resources, a website, et cetera. And of course, in person. It sounds like y'all are working on creating some spaces. But like having libraries or having a place people can go to find that community is super important. Recognize your assumptions. Again, we all make assumptions on gender based on how people look. It's completely ingrained in us. But if you make a mistake, correct yourself, call yourself out, like be a good example for people instead of just, moving on and feeling bad about it. It's really important when you, use the wrong pronouns and correct yourself or whatever it is. So use the right names and pronouns, and correct others when you hear them using the wrong ones. It's really important. Again, being that ally, it's really, as everybody knows, like being any marginalized group, you end up doing the most work for your own acceptance. And that's really hard. So when you can have allies who are advocating for you, it's really important. If you weren't sure, you can just ask someone like, hey, if somebody calls you, the wrong name, do you want me to correct them, or are you out? If you're not sure, just ask. That's cool. Practice makes better. So again, it's hard to change. Practice in front of the mirror, talk to your partner about somebody using they, them pronouns so you can get used to doing it in a safe space. Yeah, do the work behind the scenes so that when you're talking to or about that person, it's you're using the correct words. And then just offer people help and support. Maybe somebody's going through a hard time. Maybe you notice their name and pronouns have changed and you just want to check in and see if they need anything. It's really hard to transition right now, especially trans girls and women, because of like everything that's been happening. So if you have students who might be going through something, just reach out, or colleagues as well. Then advocacy, of course, isn't like a hat we take on and off between our personal and work lives or our personal and student lives, just like any other form of equality. And so there's a lot of things that we can do every day to help practice and to help normalize. And so just a couple thoughts there. Seek out and center the experiences and opinions of like diverse LGBTQI+ people. One way to do that is to diversify your media. So read journalism written by trans people, read, like follow people on social media who were very, very different than you, entertainment, movies, etc. Again, don't assume someone's gender, sex, or sexuality based on how they look or act, not just at work, but in your personal life, your family, etc. Respect people's pronouns, proactively share yours, not just at work, right? This can be, yes, at conferences, but it can be when you're meeting a new person in a friend group or something. Even if you don't see any queer or trans people in the room, speak inclusively. Again, you don't know who's queer or trans. They might be out. They might be wondering about their own gender identity or their sexuality. They might be intersex and they don't tell people. So just remember that, it's unlike some very visible diversity, gender and sexuality and sex are not always visible. Do your own research online before asking someone to explain a concept. Here's a totally safe space. I love answering questions, but generally if you work with somebody who has transitioned, do some research online before asking them, about particulars of their, very intimate details of their life. And then just believe and respect people's identities. Even if you don't understand them, we're not going to understand all of these different identities that are very, that we aren't experiencing, but we still need to respect them. So that's my super quick overview of allyship. There's a couple resources.
Brenna,
yeah.
Brenna, can you hear me? So Sharon has said that we can go an extra 10 minutes. So although we should end at 12, we can go a little bit over for questions and answers. So it's just an extra 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I would love to have that extra space. Great excuse for some water. So this is actually my last slide, just some resources. I won't go into them now, but for those of you who want to learn more, this is a great LGBTQIA+ microaggressions video. It does have some strong language. Maybe that's a plus for some of you, a minus for others. LGBT Campus looked like a good resource. I'm not intimately familiar, but they did have some policy and practice recommendations, which I thought would be really good for those of you who are administrators or staff or faculty. I worked on an Inclusion at Work series through the Global Center for LGBTI Freedom. And this is it's not campus specific, but like in general at work, here's some basics of how to treat people well, how to talk about pronouns, etc. I just published a huge report about transition during COVID. So many people have transitioned during COVID, including, I couldn't even focus on school. This is all about workplace. I would love to do a school one as a follow-up. And so this is about just learning about the gender transition and why, which I think is very relevant to students. And when people are coming back to work in person, what do we need to know to create those spaces? Again, I think there's a ton of correlations with students here. And then for those of you, especially who work with others, communicate in other languages, this is a cool language resource. It's other people have contributed. We have 17 languages and just some links to learning more about gender inclusive language within those. So that is it. I think we can stop the recording, and then any questions that you have, any other thoughts about being inclusive on campus, any just general, thoughts or questions that you'll have, other resources that you know about would be really great. Can somebody...
So first of all, let me just give you a round of applause, Brenna. Thank you so much.
Thank you.